Somewhere in the north, a king is about to ask his oldest friend for a favor that will get him killed. He doesn't know that yet. Neither does his friend. What if the War of the Five Kings never happened? Not because a battle was won, not because a marriage held, because one tired, honest man, standing in the godswood of his own home, said a single word he had never said to that king before. No. Every war needs a spark. This is the story of the spark that never caught, and the fire that was already coming from somewhere else entirely. Quick scene setting, only what you need. Robert Baratheon has worn the crown for 15 years, mostly by letting other men carry the weight of it. His hand, Jon Arryn, the man who raised Robert and Ned Stark both like sons, is dead in his bed in King's Landing. The manner of it doesn't sit right with anyone who knew him. He was a healthy man, by all accounts, right up until he wasn't. His widow fled the capital within days, taking their young son and her fear with her, and told no one exactly what she was afraid of. That silence is its own kind of evidence, if you know how to read it. And somewhere in King's Landing, at least one man already does. Robert does what Robert always does when something breaks. He rides to the one friend who never lied to him. 300 leagues north, through mud and cold, to a castle of gray stone, where a man named Ned Stark has spent 15 years quietly putting the North back together after 2 rebellions nearly tore it apart. In the world we know, Robert asks. Ned hesitates. And then, with his wife's voice in his ear, he says yes. In this world, he doesn't. Here's how that actually happens. The offer isn't made across a feast table. It's made where it's always really made. Underground, among stone kings and stone wolves, in the crypts where Ned goes to be honest with himself. Robert stands in front of his sister's statue for a long moment before he says anything at all. He's not a subtle man, but grief has taught him where to stand. I need you, he says. And it isn't a king talking. It's a boy who watched his own father figure buried a fortnight ago, asking his oldest friend not to leave him alone with it. Ned doesn't answer down there. He asks for the night, which everyone who knows him understands is not politeness. It's arithmetic. Upstairs, in the dark of their chamber, Catelyn lays out the case she has always laid out in every version of this story. A king does not forget a refusal, she tells him. Pride is the one thing a crown cannot survive losing. If you say no, he will wonder why. And a wondering king is a dangerous king. It's a good argument. It has worked before. It doesn't work this time. Because this time, Ned has an answer of his own. And it isn't pride, and it isn't fear. It's a name. His father rode south once to answer a king's summons. He came home in a box. So did his brother. Ned has spent his whole life since then making very sure his own children would never learn that particular lesson the same way. He doesn't say Brandon's name out loud. He doesn't have to. Catelyn has heard the story enough times to know exactly which ghost is standing in the room with them. I can't fight a war I can't see, he tells her. Down there, the knives don't look like knives. I'd serve him badly, and I'd die of it. And you'd bury me next to my father's bones that never came home either. I serve him better by being the wall at his back. Someone has to hold the north while he holds the realm. Catelyn is quiet for a long moment. Then hold it, she says finally, and I'll hold it with you. For the first time in their marriage, she doesn't try very hard to win this argument. Some small, unspoken part of her has been waiting 15 years for her husband to say no to that particular king. By morning, the answer is made. So, how does the king actually take it? Badly, loudly, and then, eventually, like a man too tired to keep swinging. There's fury in the godswood the next day, an accusation of abandonment, a reminder of blood spilled together on the trident. You'd leave me alone in that pit? Robert says, and there's something almost pleading underneath the rage, which he will deny to his dying day. Ned holds, not with a raised voice, Starks don't raise their voices. That's not where their stubbornness lives. But with the simple, immovable fact of not moving. The friendship cracks. It doesn't break. Robert storms out, cursing Stark pride, and 3 days later, he's gone again, riding south without a hand, which has never once happened in his reign before.
Barristan Selmy, riding at the rear of the column, watches the grey walls of Winterfell shrink behind them, and says nothing. He's served 2 kings, and buried a 3rd. He's learned not to comment on the ones who still have a choice. He does get one thing before he leaves. A promise, not a delivery. A betrothal. Sansa to Joffrey, written in ink that can, given time, be quietly unwritten. Sansa cries about it, for entirely the wrong reasons. She wanted King's Landing. She doesn't yet know her father has just kept her out of the only trap in this story with teeth sharp enough to actually kill her. Then, after the column disappears down the King's Road, the 2nd letter arrives. The one that, in another telling, reaches Ned just in time to send him south with it. Lysa Arryn's coded hand, accusing the Lannisters of murdering her husband. Ned reads it by candlelight. Catelyn watches grief move across his face for the man who was a second father to him. And then she watches him hold the letter to the flame. He doesn't march on the strength of a widow's fear and a coded page. He's on his own ground now, with his own men. So instead of riding into a lion's den to pull on that thread himself, he sends someone else to pull on it, quietly, from 1,000 miles away, where nobody in King's Landing is watching for it. One decision, one word, and now the whole board has to rearrange itself around it.
This is where the real story lives, not in what Ned decided, but in everything his decision quietly unmakes, one domino at a time. Watch how far one word travels. Robert needs a hand, regardless. He fills it with a competent, unambitious lord who balances ledgers and offends no one. No honest outsider auditing 6 million gold dragons of debt. No unfamiliar face reading the dead hand's private notes. No rival voice at the small council table. Which means Cersei Lannister, watching a Stark decline to walk into the pit she'd already imagined him climbing out of, breathes easier than she has in years. The honorable fool just stepped back from the edge, she tells her brother that night, and took us with him. She doesn't yet know what she's actually bought herself. Because the next domino doesn't fall in King's Landing at all. It falls back home, in a tower Bran Stark should never have climbed. But before it does, 2 other men in that city are already recalculating.
Peter Baelish has never needed Ned Stark specifically. He's needed a hand who trusts Catelyn Tully's family enough to act on a letter from her sister. And that plan was never really about who sat in the chair. It was about who read the letter. So when the letter goes unanswered, when no hand rides north from King's Landing, carrying Ned Stark's honesty into a den built to exploit exactly that, Littlefinger doesn't grieve the loss of his instrument. He simply looks for a new one. He is, after all, a man who has spent his whole life turning other people's certainties into his own leverage. A weak new hand, who owes his seat to Lannister money, is, if anything, easier material to work than an honest Northman ever was. Chaos isn't a pit, he tells no one in particular, watching the empty council chair from across the room. It's a ladder. He starts climbing it anyway, just more slowly, and with less blood on the first rung than history remembers. Varys says nothing at all, which, for Varys, is itself a kind of information. His real game was never Westerosi court politics. Across the narrow sea, in Pentos, a boy who isn't supposed to exist grows up under Illyrio Mopatis's roof, groomed for a throne, waiting on a war exhausted enough to want him back. And here is the uncomfortable arithmetic underneath his silence. A stable, undivided 7 kingdoms, one where no honest hand ever exposes a lie, no war ever cracks the realm open,
is not Varys' victory. It's his worst-case scenario. He needs Westeros bled and doubting itself before his restoration ever has a chance to take root. So he watches the empty council seat, listens to the quiet where a northern voice should be, and quietly files away the strange new shape of a board where the one honest man simply declined to play. He does not yet know how much that refusal is about to cost everyone, including him.
In the old story, an attempt on Bran's life sends Catelyn racing to warn her husband in King's Landing. On that road, she stumbles into Tyrion Lannister at a crossroads inn, and everything after that, the arrest, Tywin's fury, the Riverlands burning, begins there. Here, Catelyn never leaves the north. Bran still falls. That tragedy sits upstream of anything Ned decided. It happens the same night, in the same tower, for the same reason, regardless of what his father chooses about a handship 300 miles away. But the household that gathers around his broken body isn't a household missing its lord. Ned is there. He sits the small hours by his son's bed, and when the second assassin comes for the boy with a dagger too fine for a hired killer's hand, it's Ned who ends up holding that dagger afterward, not Catelyn, racing south with it toward a man who lied to her about where it came from. Because Ned keeps it. He asks who benefits from a comatose boy's silence, and follows that question like a hunter reading a broken branch, in his own solar, with his own maester, without ever setting foot south of the neck. Which means Tyrion Lannister rides home from Winterfell exactly as he arrived, untouched, unaccused. Which means Tywin never has a reason to call his banners over an insult to his son. Which means the spark that, in the world we know, ignites the Riverlands into open war simply never catches. One war, quietly uninvented, before it ever had a name. So if Ned isn't riding to King's Landing to accuse a king of murder, what does a man like him actually do with a dead friend's murder and a widow's warning? He doesn't ride south to demand justice from a man who married a lion. He's watched that road end in ruin in his own head enough times to trust the feeling. Instead, he turns inward and quietly toward the people who might actually help him. Catelyn's own blood. A letter goes to Riverrun, not an accusation, a warning between kin. Hoster Tully, old and ailing but sharp as ever, understands what his daughter means before she finishes saying it. Not war, understanding. An unspoken bond between Stark, Tully, and Aaron. If the lion ever overreaches, there will be teeth waiting in 3 kingdoms at once. Edmure Tully, younger and hotter-blooded, wants to name names outright and start drawing lines on a map. It's his father who quiets him with a raised hand. Not war, Hoster tells his son. Understanding. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that's kept this family's head attached to its shoulders for 300 years. No treaty is signed. Nothing is written down that could be found and read by the wrong eyes. It's built the oldest way anything is built in the North. On blood. And the quiet certainty of people who know exactly where they stand.
Because not everything in this story bends to Ned Stark's choices. A boar in a wood. A wound gone too deep. A king who has spent 15 years drinking his way toward this exact afternoon. Robert lingers a day, maybe 2. And in that time, the one man who might have known the truth about the children at his bedside is 1,000 miles north, behind granite walls, while the woman who has waited so patiently for so long is never far from the dying king's side. Ned's warning arrives too late. A letter urging Robert to name his brother Stannis as the lawful heir, sealed and sent the moment the Fever Raven reaches Winterfell. It never gets read by the man it was meant for. See it done, Cersei tells the scribe, before the ink on Robert's own last words has even dried. Whatever names the king actually spoke aloud in his final hours pass through her hands before anyone else's, and parchment burns quickly, quietly, without witnesses who dare say otherwise. Joffrey is crowned before his father is even in the ground.
A new boy king on the throne, and somewhere off Dragonstone, a bitter, overlooked brother who's been waiting his whole life to be taken seriously. This part isn't new to this timeline, and it's worth pausing on,
because it explains everything that comes next. Stannis Baratheon spent 15 years on the small council, believing the handship was his by right of seniority. Robert passed him over for Ned instead, and never once explained why, because Robert Baratheon has never in his life felt obligated to explain himself to his own brother. Stannis didn't forgive that. Stannis doesn't really forgive anything. He simply filed it away, the way he files everything away, as a grievance with a number attached, waiting for its turn. And now his turn has come. Not because Ned Stark exposed a secret this time, because Stannis was always going to reach this conclusion on his own, in his own cold, methodical way, whether anyone in the North ever lifted a finger to help him get there.
Here's where the absence of Ned Stark becomes the whole engine of the second half of this story. In the world we know, Ned gathers the proof of Cersei's children himself. The lineage book, the pattern of black hair where gold should be, a confession wrung out of a frightened knight. His investigation and his death over it is what gives Stannis Baratheon's claim teeth. Without that public sacrifice, Stannis' letters go out from Dragonstone exactly as true as they always were, and land on lords who have no way to tell truth from a bitter, unloved brother's convenient story. The letters are read and quietly set aside. Some are burned by men with no wish to be caught holding treason against a seated king. But one lord doesn't set it aside, because Ned already believes it. He's had the shape of this suspicion sitting in his gut since a dagger of Valyrian steel was pressed into his hand. He doesn't have Stannis' proof, but he has the pattern, and he believes every word. Ned calls his bannermen to Winterfell. The Umbers, the Karstarks, the Glovers, the Manderleys, the Boltons, with their careful, unreadable eyes. The Great Hall hasn't held this many lords under one roof since Robert's visit years ago. The banners of 100 years hang from the rafters, and the fire pops and settles, while men who rarely agree on anything wait to hear what their lord actually wants from them. He lays Stannis' claim in front of them and asks the only question that matters. Does the North bleed for a rightful Southern king, or does it stay behind its own walls? The Great Jon is the first on his feet, because of course he is. Why should the North bleed for any Baratheon at all? He booms. And then, quieter, and somehow louder for it. There sits the only king I mean to bend my knee to. The words land in that hall like a stone dropped into still water. It's the oldest thought in the North, finally spoken out loud, in a room full of men who've been quietly thinking it for 100 years.
Ned doesn't take the crown. Not yet. I'm honored, my lord, he tells the Great Jon, but I won't wear a crown built on another man's rightful claim while he still draws breath. Not everyone in that hall is so eager to bend a knee anywhere at all. Mage Mormont, blunt where the Great Jon is loud, doesn't stand to be dramatic about it. She just says what she thinks. If Stannis is the rightful heir, then law is law, and a Northman keeps his word, she says. But I won't send the daughters of Bear Island to die on a southern field for a king who's never once looked north in his life. Support him. Don't die for him. Roose Bolton says nothing at all for a long while, which is somehow the loudest thing in the room. When he finally speaks, it's so quietly that every man leans in just to catch it. Why march south at all, he asks, when the South seems so eager to consume itself? Let them. What he does instead is thread a needle. The North lends Stannis its name, its legitimacy, its voice, without emptying its halls of spears to do it. Legitimacy as a weapon that costs nothing to wield. It might have worked if Stannis were the only king with a claim.
Renly doesn't kneel. He never was going to. He has the Reach's 50,000 swords, Marjorie Tyrell's hand, and the simple, seductive fact that men would rather die for someone they love than someone they merely owe. Ned's careful, lawyerly letter warning him off reads back sweeter than a threat, and just as deaf. The realm wants him, so what does blood matter? Stannis is worse in his way.
Not because he's wrong, but because being right with nothing else to hold on to has made him hard and cornered and willing to reach for whatever strength is closest at hand. Ned's second letter, begging him to stay away from the Red Woman on Dragonstone, whispering about kings reborn in flame, arrives, is read, and changes nothing. A drowning man doesn't examine the character of the hand pulling him up. He only grabs. So the brothers do what brothers with the same claim and no way to share it have always eventually done. Renly dies in the dark before a parley that never happens, killed by something with his own brother's face and none of his own brother's guilt. His army, the largest single force gathered south of the Neck, simply stops being an army the moment its center is cut out of it. It becomes a crowd.
Tywin Lannister, watching from Casterly Rock, understands the opportunity before the Tyrells even finish grieving. A new marriage offer, a new alliance. The rose turns back to the lion, the way it always eventually does when it has no better option. Margaery Tyrell, twice widowed by 2 dead kings before she's old enough to have chosen either of them, learns to smile at the second wedding, exactly the way she smiled at the first. It's a skill nobody teaches on purpose. She simply had to learn it twice now. And behind her mountains, the Vale watches all of it and commits to none of it. Lysa Arryn hoards her son and her grief in equal measure, sends no army south for either brother, and calls it caution. History will eventually call it something closer to cowardice. Ned reads the account of a king murdered by his own blood, and for the first time in this story, his hand isn't quite steady. Not fear, something colder. He writes one more letter, withdrawing every scrap of legitimacy he'd lent the Stannis cause. A coalition bought with a brother's murder isn't one he'll stand inside of, whatever it costs him. It costs him quite a lot. It fractures the very alliance he spent a season building, right before the biggest battle of the war.
Blackwater Bay still burns. Stannis' fleet still comes. Wildfire still blooms green across the water. And Tywin still arrives at the last possible hour with the Tyrell host at his back to save a boy king he privately can't stand. Tyrion still holds the walls with nothing but wit, wildfire, and a scar he'll carry the rest of his life. "Where's the little Lord of Winterfell when you actually need him?" he mutters at one point, to no one, watching the bay burn green from the battlements. He isn't really asking. He already knows the answer, and he doesn't blame Ned Stark for it half as much as he thinks he should. But it's a narrower, bloodier victory than the one we know, because there are no 10,000 northern spears anywhere near that battle. Ned Stark chose Winterfell's walls over King's Landing's gates, and that single refusal means the South fights the South with nothing but southern blood to spend. The Lannisters win, and come out of it gutted. The Tyrells come out of it crowned in glory and desperately short of men. And across the Neck, an untouched North watches its rivals stagger off that field, exhausted, their treasuries and their granaries both running dry. Ned feels no joy watching it, only the grim confirmation of something he's always suspected, that the South will devour itself, given enough time, and a wise man only has to decline the invitation to the feast. Victory has its own appetite, though. A throne that's just been won can't tolerate a kingdom that won't bow to it. The Raven from King's Landing doesn't ask for Sansa. It demands her, dressed up as an old betrothal being honored, as though nothing at all has happened in the years between. Ned knows exactly what's actually being asked for. Not a wedding, a hostage. He doesn't send her. He never was going to. When he tells Sansa the betrothal is over for good, she doesn't cry the way she once might have. She's older now, and she's heard enough about what actually happened to the girl who did go south. "I know, Father," is all she says. And that, more than anything else in this whole story, is the sound of a childhood quietly, mercifully, not being ruined. His reply to King's Landing names Joffrey for what the boy actually is. No true king, no true-born Baratheon, a child born of 2 siblings wearing a crown he was never entitled to. He seals it in grey wax. He knows precisely what he's just done. Not opened a door, burned it off its hinges.
House Stark is declared traitor within the fortnight, a word that means less and less to a realm too exhausted to enforce it. Tywin reads the northern refusal, and, unlike his daughter, doesn't rage. He does arithmetic. The Neck has swallowed better armies than ours, he tells his brother Keevan, flatly, and that's the end of the conversation. He measures the length of the King's Road against the strength of his own thinned host, and remembers a narrow, drowning stretch of marsh where armies have gone to die for 10,000 years. He doesn't march, not yet. He reaches instead for a subtler blade, letters offering pardons to Riverrun and the Vale if they'll abandon the wolf. Isolate the North, strip it of friends, deal with it later once the treasury's refilled. The letters find no purchase. Catelyn's quiet understanding between three kingdoms holds. Tywin sets the replies down, steeples his fingers, and starts thinking of another way. While Tywin is still thinking, someone else already has an answer, just not the one anybody in King's Landing is expecting.
Balon Greyjoy has been waiting his whole life for exactly this kind of southern exhaustion, counting ships and grievances with a fisherman's patience. In the world we know, he looks toward a hollowed-out north and takes it apart from the inside. Here, there's no hollow to fill. Balon looks toward Winterfell and sees gray stone, gray wolves, and steady spears that never left home. Whatever else he is, he doesn't strike at strength. So his longships turn elsewhere, toward the soft, fat coastlines that grew comfortable while the north stayed watchful. Lannisport wakes to smoke on the water. The Reach's golden granaries burn under salt-stained torches instead. Theon Greyjoy, still a ward at Winterfell in this telling, watches his own house's raiders burn someone else's shore from 1,000 miles away and feels an old, familiar pull he doesn't fully understand yet. Loyalty to a family that never sent for him, aimed at a war he isn't part of. It's a smaller wound than the one history remembers him carrying, but it's there. Tywin, already juggling 3 defiant kingdoms he can't afford to invade, now has to unclench his hands to defend his own hearth. Every kingdom in this story is now looking somewhere else, south at each other, west at the sea. Nobody is looking north, which turns out to matter more than any of it.
Through all of it, quieter than any of it, ravens keep arriving at Winterfell from the wall, carried in Jon Snow's increasingly careful hand. Wildlings gathering under a single king for the first time in living memory. Villages found empty. Whispers of a cold that walks, and dead men who don't stay dead. Ned reads every one of them himself. This is the difference a single word has made across all these years. He isn't broken, or fled south into a den of knives, or dead on the steps of a sept while the watch begged for help nobody sent. He's here, whole, at the height of his strength, a lord who spent a decade listening to the land and the wind and his own house's long memory. So when his own blood, sworn to the black, tells him winter isn't just coming, but arriving with teeth, he believes him. It isn't glamorous work, what follows. There are no battles yet, no songs to write about it. Just wagons and lists, and a decade of unglamorous logistics that nobody south of the Neck will ever hear about.
Grain wagons start rolling north along the King's Road. Volunteers and Second Sons and Mountain Clan hardcases start heading for a wall most of them have never once thought about. 19 abandoned forts start, quietly, to be imagined manned again. Wyman Manderley, practical as ever, starts quietly shipping dragonglass and iron up the White Knife before anyone's even asked him to. Robb Stark rides north, not toward a battlefield grave in someone else's war, but toward Moat Cailin first, to seal the Neck so tightly that no army on earth could force it open. Then, later, toward the wall itself, to breathe life back into a dying order nobody south of the Neck has thought about in living memory. While kings die and letters burn and armies turn their prows toward each other, 2 sisters are simply growing up. Sansa is older now, old enough to understand exactly what her father spared her from. She still keeps her southern songs. She just no longer prays to be their subject. Arya is nearly grown too, still running the yard with a wooden sword, except now there's no Joffrey to fear.
No King's Landing at all in the shape of her life. Just a girl who gets to be difficult in peace. Bran sits by the fire some evenings with a stillness that unsettles the maester, dreaming of a tree and eyes and things that haven't happened yet. A family, mostly whole, which is, by the standards of this story, already a kind of miracle. So why does none of this feel like a happy ending?
Every single choice in this alternate history is the right one. Ned refuses a doomed office. He protects his wife, his sons, his daughters. He starves a war of its spark before it ever catches. He watches his rivals bleed each other on his behalf, for free, without spending a single northern life. He builds the wall back up while everyone south of the Neck is still busy deciding which liar king to die for. By every measure this genre usually cares about, House Stark wins. Nobody gets beheaded on the steps of a sept. Nobody gets murdered at a wedding. Nobody rides north with a crown on her head and dragons at her back to find a graveyard where a family used to be. And that is exactly the problem. Because the thing that saves the North is the same thing that isolates it. 100 years of Southern lords have spent this entire story learning over and over that the North's problems are the North's alone to solve. That Ned Stark handles his own affairs, asks for nothing, needs nothing, and comes when called only on his own terms. So when the Wall's letters finally stop asking for advice and start asking for soldiers, nobody south of the Neck has ever been taught to listen. In the world we know, it takes a war, a death, a family destroyed on camera for the whole realm to watch, before anyone south of Winterfell takes the North seriously as anything but a cold, distant afterthought. That tragedy is horrifying. It is also, in its own terrible way, the thing that finally makes the South pay attention. Here, there was no tragedy loud enough to make them look. There was only a competent, quiet lord who solved his own problems for a decade, exactly the way everyone always assumed he would. Picture the actual moment this fails. A raven lands in a sept in the Reach, or a sept in the Vale, carrying Jon Snow's warning and Ned Stark's own careful seal. A maester reads it aloud to a lord half listening over his supper. The North again, the lord says, and goes back to his meal. It isn't cruelty. It's habit. Nobody ever taught him to hear that raven any differently.
So when the true war finally comes, when the dead start walking under a sky gone the color of old bone, the North faces it with a stronger wall, a fuller granary, a united, uncracked bloodline of Stark, Tully, and Arryn standing behind it, and almost no one else. No southern armies race north to help, because no crisis ever taught them the North was worth racing toward. No Dragon Queen arrives to burn a path through the dead, because her story, thousands of miles away across the narrow sea, was never touched by any of this. It runs on its own clock, in its own country, and there's no reason on this earth for it to arrive here in time. The war that, in the world we know, eventually pulled every surviving faction in Westeros into one shrinking circle of firelight never happens, because there was never a shattering enough to force them all into the same room.
Ned Stark spends a decade making every right decision. And every right decision quietly teaches the rest of the realm that the North doesn't need them. Somewhere in this decade, Stannis Baratheon, cold, humorless, and correct about almost everything he's ever been correct about, sends his own warning south about the things his brother's letters describe. He gets the same answer everyone in the North gets. Polite acknowledgement, no troops. No urgency. For the first time in his life, Stannis Baratheon and Eddard Stark agree completely about something. Neither of them can convince anyone to care. Saving the Seven Kingdoms from a war of ambition may be exactly what leaves them undefended against the only war that was ever actually going to matter.
History, in the version we all know, remembers Eddard Stark as the man honor killed. The lord too honest for a city built on lies, executed on steps he should never have climbed in the first place. In this version, history barely remembers him at all. He never becomes a martyr. He never becomes a cause.
he becomes something quieter, and in its own way, lonelier. The man who was right about everything, and paid for it in a currency no one thought to notice was missing, until the fires in the south finally, uselessly, went out, and the cold kept coming anyway. One word, spoken in a godswood on an ordinary northern morning, it saved a family. It starved a war. And it may have left the only war that ever truly mattered to be fought by far too few people, far too alone, at the edge of a very long winter. Somewhere south of the Neck, men are still arguing over a chair made of melted swords, entirely unaware that the argument stopped mattering the moment the first snow fell early this year. The road not taken kept House Stark alive. But maybe, just maybe, it was the darker road all along.
Ned Stark will never stand trial. He will never lose his head on a sept steps in front of a jeering crowd. No song will ever be written about him, because no one will ever need to grieve him loudly enough to write one. He simply grows old, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of a man who was right about everything, and never once got to prove it to anyone who mattered. Because right now, somewhere past the wall, an army that has never once needed to hurry is finally moving. And for the first time in this entire story, Ned Stark isn't the one holding all the pieces anymore. His son is. Robb Stark just inherited a wall his father spent 10 years quietly rebuilding, and no idea yet of what's actually walking toward it. That's episode 2. If you want to see whether 10 years of preparation is enough when no one south of the Neck is coming to help, tell me in the comments, because that's the case file I'm opening next. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. We're back tomorrow. Until then, peace out.